Azhar traditions. You know, that ijma' al-rukn al-rakin yastanidu ilayhi ad-din. That ijma' is the firm column on which the religion rests. And he says in one of his books that ijma' is the bedrock on which the Church of Islam is founded. I feel like this is something he heard and kind of translated. That's just my opinion. I have no proof for that. Anyway, but his work on early Islam is amongst the best. I mean, he really knows what he's talking about. Nowadays, you see a lot of people writing about early Islam who have no idea what they're talking about, and have nasty agendas or something. But he had his biases, but he was a very good scholar, very thorough. What his argument was, again, the assumption is that orthodoxy is construction, hadiths are made up, and his argument is that hadiths don't tell us about the Prophet's life. They are a reflection of the community's will, the Muslim community's will, and what the history they want to construct for themselves. How does he know this? Because of anachronism. So if you have hadiths that talk about, there will come a time when, there will be black banners that will come from the east, from Khorasan, and you should join this army because this is the army of the Mahdi. So, well, this is clearly made up during the Abbasid Revolution because the Abbasids had black banners and they were based in Khorasan, and this they made up as propaganda to get people to join their causes. If you find a hadith that says that Sa'id man junnib al-fitan, that the happy person is the one who doesn't get involved in any kind of civil strife, he doesn't get involved in politics, well, this is clearly concocted by Muslims during the Abbasid period when they're trying to basically get everybody to calm down and not get involved in political strife anymore. Or if you find a hadith that says that Ali is to me what Aaron was to Moses, well, this was clearly made up by Shiites in their attempt to convince others that Ali should be, and the family of the Prophet should lead. And another hadith that says that, Muawiyah it's as if he was, or another example, that the Prophet inquired after Muawiyah and he wasn't there, and then he came later and he said, I was sitting beneath the throne of God. Okay, this is clearly made up by pro-Umayyad forces to legitimize the figure of Muawiyah. So he looks at, if you, in theory, the Prophet could have said all these things. If you believe the Prophet knows the future, he could have said all this, and this could all be completely accurate. But because the assumption is that he doesn't know, because the assumption is that people are making this up to construct an orthodoxy, determining what interests these various hadiths serve tells you when they were made up and by whom. Is that clear? This is Goldsher's argument. So there's hadiths that are made up to shore up Umayyad legitimacy, and that's where you get a lot of the political hadiths. The law, hadiths of law, Goldsher says, were made up during the Abbasid period, from the mid-700s to the mid-800s, because the Abbasids decided that they wanted to rule sort of with this position of Islamic legitimacy as people who were going to bring back the Sunnah of the Prophet. And they have to figure out how to provide some Islam for people to follow. And they just make up, they support hadith scholars, and these hadith scholars just make up all these hadiths to create a legal code. The people of Ra'i, the sort of the Hanafi school more, he says, they just took the existing provincial laws and made them Islamic. He says that they at least were creative but not dishonest. The hadith scholars were dishonest because they attributed all this stuff to the Prophet. So kind of the general bodies of hadith that we find in hadith books that are used in fiqh and theology were created, in his opinion, during the early Abbasid period. You had a question?
Sorry, it was just a quick question about regards to when these hadiths pop up. Say, for example, the hadith about the black banner. It was never heard during the times of the Umayyads, and Sunni appeared during the Abbasids. You could assume that it was for ultra. Is there one way of looking at it? when these hadiths pop up in
Yeah.
narration?
Well, I'll speak about that right now, because you have to, unless you happen to have lived throughout the Abbasid and Umayyad period, which I doubt you did, unless you're an immortal and we're in Highlander or something like that. Which is, no one even watches these movies anymore. Yeah, I used to love these movies when I was a kid. So the point is, we don't know that. How do you figure out if when a hadith popped up? And that's where we get to the next figure, which is Joseph Schacht, who's a German scholar. Very interesting figure. He's a German scholar, but he leaves Germany, I think, right before World War II. And not very enamored with the direction in which his country was going, and he moved to England, and eventually to the United States. And he is a very whereas Goldzer here is really looking at the metin of the hadith, the content of the hadith, to tell you when it's made up. What agenda is this hadith advancing? That tells you when it was made up. For Schacht, he looks at the isnad as well. So, well, yes, we already saw you. Thank you. Okay, here's. Oh, look, you even have a green line that has been preserved for you. Wonderful. So this is Schacht looks at the isnad, and what he says is he mostly relied on the 6 books. He relied on the of Shafi'i. Shafi'i's sort of compiled writings by his student Rabi' bin Sulaiman al-Muradi. And he looks at the hadiths dealing with legal issues. And what he says is, if we collect the different narrations of a hadith, what we find is that the prophet, it's attributed to a prophet, then a companion, then a successor, and then let's say at some point you get this, what he calls the common link. And if you look at all the isnads, you kind of create an isnad tree. What you see is that it's after this common link that it really spreads out. So what he says is, our assumption is that this common link is the person who actually originated this hadith. They made it up, they attributed it to the prophet. Because if it had existed earlier, it would have been transmitted more widely. We would have all these other, isnads going out from the companion, from the successor. So what Schacht also does is this is a way you can figure out when this appeared. It appeared with this figure, this common link. What he finds is, if you look, let's say, at the Muwatta of Malik, Imam Malik, died 179, 795, 796. You find a hadith, or a report, that is attributed to a successor. Someone like Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, died around 93 Hijri, the son-in-law of Abu Hurairah. And then you look in the of the Shafi'i. Shafi'i is Malik's student, died 820 of the Common Era. And you find the same report, this time it's attributed to a companion. Let's say it's attributed to Abu Hurairah. And then you look in Sahih al-Bukhari. Bukhari is 2 people away from Shafi'i. 2 people away from Malik. Or actually, sometimes 1 person away from Malik. Often 1 person. And you find the same hadith, and it's attributed to the Prophet. So what Shaykh says is that this is back growth of the isnad. The isnad is growing backwards as time goes on. And what he says is, in the early Islamic period, the time of the companions, the time of the successors, between let's say the beginning of the Second Civil War in 680 and the late 700s, that Islamic law is actually local law. Islam is actually these different local schools, of Medina, of Kufa, of Basra. Everybody has their, there's no notion that Sunnah of the Prophet is something that unifies them all. They just have their local schools, the Kufans and the Basrans and the Medinans. Now what happens is, they're all competing with each other. The Kufan says, I think the correct position on drinking nabid is this, and the Basran says, I think it's that. How do they beat each other over the head with evidence. What evidence are they going to find? Well, successor says this. Sa'id al-Musayyib says this. Support me. And then the Basran says, oh yeah? Well, look what I have. It's actually a companion in my book who says this. And then eventually, his argument is that Imam Shafi'i comes along in the late 700s and makes the Prophet Muhammad the source that everybody has to go to. He's sort of the ultimate trump card, is the Prophet. And his argument is that since, if you look at the 6 books, these are the vast majority of their contents are hadiths from the Prophet that go back to the Prophet. They must originate after the time of the Shafi'i in the late 700s. So it's really in the late 700s to the early 800s that the world of hadith that Sunni Muslims know and love is created. It's created as a back projection of what was originally actually local schools of law, opinions of successors, that gets pushed back first to the companions and then to the Prophet. So his argument is that if you come across if you see something attributed to a successor, it is more historically accurate and earlier than something that's attributed to a companion, and more historically accurate and earlier than something attributed to the Prophet. Is this clear? Have I lost anybody? Yes.
Looking at early Islam, we understand that Islam spread quite rapidly around the world. We went to India, went to North Africa, etc., etc. And therefore, many of the companions even as far as, for example, Cyprus. Isn't it perfectly conceivable? Also, sometimes certain companions had ijata and ijaza. So for certain hadiths, it was transmitted to them, but it wouldn't be for the lay people. Examples of which Abu Huraira, I'm paraphrasing is I have 2 pots of knowledge. If I was to reveal one pot, I reveal one pot, another pot if I reveal, you chop off my head. That's just a paraphrasing thing. So isn't it conceivable that hadiths that came centuries later were probably around at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but they were given to certain people?
That's a very good point. These are they're locally limited. Okay, that's an important point, which will be brought to bear on Schacht. Because Schacht's, an important assumption here, is very important, is the idea of an argument e silentio, or out of silence. I think I wrote that down somewhere. It's not on this slide. It should be. E silentio. Sometimes you can get a little pen, and I will write in terrible handwriting. Students love this when I do it. It's like an Etch-a-Sketch. I don't know if you have those in England. Argument from silence. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Or as former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, which is actually correct from an Islamic perspective. Donald Rumsfeld, not good ideas, but sometimes pearls of wisdom. My wife always gets angry when I say that. But the argument is, if you don't have it, if in fact Malik is this Muslim scholar, he should want to create the strongest argument possible for his position. If he only includes a successor opinion in his book, and not a prophetic hadith of the same content, it must mean that the prophetic hadith didn't exist, because if it did, he would have included it. That's the argument in silencio. As you've said, there are numerous reasons why this might not be there. This is something that is it's a criticism of his work, a good criticism. But that's the argument. This is absolutely core for his argument. Because the backgrowth of isnads is based on the idea that originally it was not a prophetic hadith. There was no prophetic hadith. And that it gets pushed back farther and farther to more and more powerful sources of legitimacy until it ends up with the ultimate source of legitimacy, which is the Prophet. Now, of importance.
We'll stop the questions because I think, like with this question, you're going to be answered later.
Yeah.
How long will Juynboll take?
I'm just going to be very quick.
That's fine. Then we'll have
Very
to
quick.
take a break after Juynboll.
So, Juynboll, G.H.A. Juynboll is a Dutch scholar who died about a year and a half ago. He's a very interesting fellow. His family, actually, the Juynboll family was a merchant family that was involved in Dutch East India Company and Dutch colonial activities in Southeast Asia. And some of his relatives, the previous generation and the previous generation, were leading scholars of Islam in Southeast Asia. So he comes from a family, really, that proves both, sort of the Orientalist, sort of an Orientalist tradition of studying Islam, but it's also linked to colonial activities. It's very important. So he did a tremendous number of studies of hadith, and he really builds on Schach's methods and kind of, yes, we saw you already, and you. Here we go. So here he really kind of elaborates Schach's methods more and creates a new jargon for discussing them. So what his argument is, again, the common link is the, here we go. The common link is the person who makes up the hadith. His argument is Muslims love hadith. They're always talking about hadiths. They're always talking about how you should listen to the Prophet. They're always talking about how many gazillions of people went and attended the hadith circles of Sufyan ibn Uyayna or Shu'b ibn al-Hajjaj in Basra. Hundreds, thousands of people there attending these lessons, hearing hadiths. If really this was happening, you'd have dozens of people transmitting these hadiths. If you don't have them then, means these hadiths must not have been transmitted. His argument is that if you go back and you construct isnad trees based on hadith collections, those moments of contact, of connection, that are testified to or established by numerous transmissions from that source, those are historically reliable moments of transmission. You can say this happened. The hadith existed. This person actually said this. If you don't have these numerous transmissions from a supposed source, since Muslims are obsessed with hadith and they love attending these sessions and listening and transmitting, if it doesn't happen, then it must not have happened. The hadith didn't exist. So, where are all the people from this companion? Where are all the people who are supposedly transmitting this from the successor? They didn't exist. The hadith wasn't around. This guy made it up. How do we know that? Because we have these other sources. And he talks about partial common links who are figures who transmit the material from that original source. But if we look at hadith collections, let's say Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan of Abu Dawood, we find there's other material as well. We see, let's say, in the Mu'jam of al-Tabarani, Mu'jam al-Kabir of al-Tabarani died 360, 971. Abul Qasim al-Tabarani from Isfahan, originally from Tiberias on the Galilee Sea, moves to Isfahan for 60 years and learns 3 words of Persian. Just enough to order out. So he said, he didn't know very much Persian. This is a mark of pride because he never really got involved in non-Arabic things, enough to say hello and things like that. So you find an isnad in, let's say, Tabarani's. It doesn't go by this route, by this common link. How do we explain this? Now, according to Juynboll's method and Schach's method, is this a historically reliable transmission? Does anyone have an answer for that?
No.
Why not?
You don't have the numerous transmissions.
Exactly. This is just made up because if it were real, you'd have all these people coming out of this transmitter and this transmitter. So this guy made it up. Why did he make it up? He wants his own isnad. He wants a shorter isnad. or he wants to help in this great conspiracy to make this hadith seem more reliable. He calls this a dive isnad, that kind of dives in around the side. And sometimes you'll have a hadith that doesn't have a common link. It's just a bunch of single strands. He calls those spiders. And those for him are not, you can't establish them as existing at any time, basically, until the collection in which they're found. Now, a very important position of Juynboll. Okay. Is that, and it's implicit in Schacht, it's explicit in Juynboll, is that, in effect, all hadiths are made up. I mean, you know, you can, if this is your criteria, if these are your criteria for determining when a hadith enters circulation, that it happens with a common link. And if the common link is always someone who's, let's say, a successor or beyond. For Juynboll, he says that these people usually exist in the early, 700 to 720, 700 to 730 of the Common Era. This is when hadiths are made up. There are no reliably authentic hadiths of the Prophet. And he has an article on the famous hadith of man kadhaba alayhi muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu min an-nar. Whoever lies about me, or misrepresents me intentionally, let him prepare for himself a seat in hellfire. He has an article on this in which he shows, according to his methodology, that it cannot be established as going back to the Prophet. So if this hadith, which is for Muslims the most authentic hadith, between 60 and 100 companions transmitted. Tabarani has a whole book on the people who transmit this hadith. If this is not reliable, then nothing is. There is no reliably establishable hadith of the Prophet. So what you have, what the hadith tradition is a gigantic conspiracy. Muir had been critical. He says, looks at Bukhari and he says a third to a half of this book is nonsense. But the rest is, the Prophet had to say something. And it's generally reliable. With Gold here, you have skepticism. You have a hadith, if it seems to be to support some agenda, you take it out. That's something made up later. But this idea implicit in Schacht, explicit in Juynboll, is that nothing in the hadith tradition is really representative of something the Prophet actually said. Okay, I will end there. We'll start next time.
Yeah, we'll just take a short refreshment break. 10 minutes, please. Probably prompt that. Thank you.
Some of these, we're going to do, those who do registration a bit later, and also I'm going to need everybody